There's a place on this planet where the sea genuinely doesn't welcome visitors. It circles the bottom of the world in a single unbroken ring, with no coastline to slow it down and no island to break its momentum. Nothing but water endlessly turning around a continent of ice. Sailors who've actually crossed it tend to talk about it the way other people talk about a bad memory they'd rather not revisit, lowering their voices, choosing their words carefully. And if you press long enough, a surprising number of them will eventually mention a shape. Not a whale, not a diver, not debris lost overboard, but something pale and impossibly long gliding just beneath the surface with a kind of patient, deliberate certainty that raises the hair on your neck before your brain can even explain why. There's a word for the thing people describe. It comes from Japan, and it's almost unbearably simple. Ningen. In Japanese, it just means human. That's the entire unsettling core of the legend distilled into 2 syllables. People who claim to have seen this thing didn't reach for the name of some undiscovered species of whale or squid. They reached for the word that means, one of us. Because whatever they thought they were looking at in the half-light of the polar night apparently looked like it was looking back. Recently, new clips and images claiming to show the Ningen have been circulating widely again, racking up views and igniting exactly the kind of breathless, is this finally real energy that's followed this creature online for 2 decades. So it's worth actually sitting down and taking this seriously, not with a shaky video and a promise that this time the footage is real, but with something rarer and, in the end, considerably stranger than any sea monster. The actual, traceable story of where this legend came from, why it refuses to die, and what that new footage everyone keeps sharing actually turns out to be once you look closely. Let's start where this story has to start, with the water itself, because the Southern Ocean isn't just a backdrop for this legend. It's the reason the legend can exist at all. Picture a stretch of sea so remote it has no other shore. Every other ocean on Earth eventually runs into land somewhere. The Atlantic has the Americas and Africa, the Pacific is bounded, however distantly, by continents on either side. But the water circling Antarctica flows in a great, uninterrupted current that never touches a continent along its entire path. It just goes around and around, driven by winds with nothing to stop them, building some of the tallest sustained waves found anywhere on the planet. These aren't sudden freak swells. They're walls of gray water arriving with the steadiness of a heartbeat, one after another, because storms down there don't blow through in an afternoon, they settle in and can last the better part of a week, throwing spray sideways across the deck until ropes freeze solid and railings glaze over in a skin of ice that has to be chipped away just to get a grip. Then there's the cold. Water at these latitudes sits barely above freezing, close enough to that threshold that it seems to hover there. A person who goes overboard doesn't get minutes of struggle and hope. They get minutes, period, before hypothermia and cardiac shock take over. Sailors carry that knowledge in their bones. It shapes how they move on deck, how carefully they clip themselves to safety lines, how they never fully relax when the rail is close and the water is that particular shade of dark. Now picture standing at that rail during the polar season, when the sun barely clears the horizon and everything sits inside a long, gray, colorless twilight that seems to drain the world of anything solid. The line between sea and sky goes soft. Your eyes, hunting for reference points that simply aren't there, start inventing them. That's the stage this legend plays out on. And the danger of this ocean isn't only what it can do to a human body. It's also what it hides. For all our satellites and sonar and centuries of exploration, we've genuinely mapped the surface of the moon in finer detail than large stretches of seafloor beneath these waters. There are trenches down there we've barely glimpsed, pressures that would crush a submarine, entire regions of deep polar ocean no human eye has ever directly seen. Into that darkness, imagination is free to pour whatever it wants, and that's precisely the crack a legend like the Ningen slips through. When you can't see the bottom of something, you start wondering what might be looking back up at you. Here's where it's worth being upfront, earlier than these stories usually allow. The honest, verifiable answer is this. There is no Ningen specimen in any museum, no skeleton in any collection, no verified photograph that's ever survived serious scrutiny. By every standard science uses to establish that something is real, the Ningen doesn't exist. No body has ever washed ashore. No net has ever brought one up. No expedition has ever returned with anything except stories. And yet the story refuses to die, resurfacing every few years with a new clip that sends the same wave of comments through social media insisting that this time the footage is real. That persistence, a legend built on essentially nothing repeatedly refusing to fade, is genuinely worth examining, not because it proves a monster exists, but because it reveals something real about how people pass along what they think they've seen. To actually understand the Ningen, you first have to understand who's been doing the seeing, because this legend doesn't trace back to drunk deckhands or nervous cruise tourists. The earliest accounts, the ones that gave the story its weight, are usually framed as coming from research and survey crews working some of the most remote water on Earth, people whose entire job is observation, logging conditions and marine life for months at a time, reading the horizon the way the rest of us read a page. People like that know what a whale looks like at a distance, know how ice moves, know the difference between a wave and a wake and a shadow. When a story claims a seasoned professional was rattled enough to call others to the rail so they wouldn't have to carry the memory alone, it's borrowing that professional credibility, and it works, because we're wired to lean in when someone whose entire job is not being fooled by the ocean claims to have been fooled anyway. Here's how these sightings tend to be described. It's almost always that long polar half-light, sea and sky and ice all bleeding into one pale surface with no strong shadows to give anything depth. Someone on watch, straining for any reference point, spots a pale patch on the water, low and long and just under the surface. The first thought is always the reasonable one. Ice. Of course it's ice. This is an ocean full of it. So the watcher looks away, then looks back, and the shape has moved. That alone isn't strange. Ice moves constantly, pushed by wind and current. But this is where these accounts typically pivot toward something colder. The tellers insist the shape wasn't simply drifting with everything else around it. The smaller ice, the foam, the slush, all of it moving one direction with the current, and this pale shape supposedly holding its own line, cutting across the drift as though it had somewhere specific to be. That single detail does a lot of narrative work. An object that goes wherever the water pushes it stays an object in the listener's mind. Something that seems to hold its own direction against the current crosses a line, stops being an it, and starts becoming a who. And notably, the tellers of these stories rarely dwell on size at first. What they keep coming back to is intention, the unsettling impression that whatever they saw had chosen to be there and chosen which way to go. That's the actual hook buried inside the legend, not the monster itself, but the suggestion of being watched back. In the fuller versions, a lone witness's private unease becomes something shared, because it's rarely just one person. The watcher calls out, others come to the rail, and now there's a small huddle of people staring at the same pale shape holding its impossible line. As the story goes, the shape resolves into something with edges and structure, something too long for a beluga, too pale for any whale on the log, without a dorsal fin or blowhole or the rolling arc of a surfacing back. And in the versions that have kept this legend circulating for 2 decades, the details sharpen further. A bulge near the front red as a head, shapes along the sides red as arms, and in the most vivid tellings, a hand, 5 fingers breaking the surface and slowly closing around nothing. Below that, descriptions split, some insisting on legs trailing pale into the dark, others describing something closer to a single tapering fin, and a rare few claiming that as the thing turned in the water, they saw a face, with eyes set forward the way ours are, and a mouth beneath them. That's the shape this legend keeps handing back to us, crew after crew, telling after telling, in the coldest, loneliest water on Earth. And before picking that shape apart, it's worth asking a stranger, more useful question than what did they see? The better question is, where did the story of what they supposedly saw actually come from? Because the honest answer isn't out on the water at all. It's on a screen, at a keyboard, in a quiet room nowhere near any ocean. Because for all the talk of seasoned crews and freezing rails and pale shapes holding their line against the current, the Ningen doesn't trace back to a ship's log, a captain's journal, or a century-old whaling report. Follow the thread back far enough, past the retellings and reposts and breathless narration videos, and you don't arrive at the sea. You arrive at an internet message board, specifically Japanese online forums sometime in the mid-2000s, where anonymous users began posting stories and pressing submit. That's where this actually begins, not with a sighting, but with a post. The earliest accounts carry that particular texture anyone who spent real time online will recognize immediately. They're always secondhand. The person writing didn't see the thing themselves. They knew someone, a friend of a friend, an acquaintance who supposedly worked on a research vessel doing whale surveys out in the far southern waters, and this friend of a friend had allegedly seen something enormous, pale, and unmistakably shaped like a human being. And here's the detail every good version of the story keeps. The friend of a friend wouldn't talk about it in detail, went quiet whenever it came up, as though the seeing itself had cost them something, as if there were some unspoken rule among these crews about not discussing what surfaced in the dark. It's a remarkably self-sealing structure. There's no name to check, no vessel to trace, no date to pin down, and the one person who supposedly witnessed the thing is, by the very design of the story, unwilling to elaborate. You can't interview a silence. You can't fact-check a friend of a friend. The account floats free, unanchored, impossible to confirm and, just as conveniently, impossible to definitively disprove. Then the name arrived. Ningen, human. The moment that word attached itself to the vague pale shape in these anonymous posts, it stopped being a formless smudge in a second-hand story and became something with an identity, something you could search for and share. And once something has a name, it can travel and it can be drawn, which is exactly what happened next on the same image boards where this story lived. Users did what internet communities have always done with an evocative, undocumented idea. They visualized it, taking the pale body, the impossible length, the arms, the hint of a face, and rendering it as art. Some of these illustrations were crude. Some were genuinely striking. And a handful were polished enough that, stripped of context and passed from account to account, they started circulating as though they were something other than what they actually were, treated less like fan art and more like evidence, as if a drawing of a monster and a photograph of one were somehow the same category of thing. This is the part of the story that explains almost everything else about how it behaves. Once you understand the Ningen was born as an anonymous, second-hand internet tale wrapped around a word meaning human, you start to see exactly why it keeps resurfacing every few years in a new video, a new thread, a new wave of comments insisting this clip, finally, is the real one. It survives because, without anyone deliberately engineering it, the story ended up almost perfectly built to spread. Consider what it has going for it. First, the setting. It happens in one of the only places on Earth virtually none of us will ever personally visit, and that even the people who do go there can't fully map. You can't drive out to the Southern Ocean on a weekend to check for yourself. The location is, whether by accident or instinct, essentially unverifiable by ordinary means. Second, the borrowed authority of the insider witness, the professional crew member whose entire job is knowing the sea, lends the story a credibility it hasn't actually earned, since these experts are conveniently unnamed and unreachable. Third, and this is the deepest hook of all, the shape itself. It isn't shaped like a shark or a squid or some tentacled abstraction. It's shaped like us, scaled up to the size of a ship, and that specific image, the human form made vast and wrong and somewhere it shouldn't be, taps into something considerably older than the internet, something wired deep into how human brains scan for and react to the silhouettes of other people. And fourth, maybe most important of all, the absence of proof itself. A story with an airtight photograph is a closed story. There's nothing left to do with it but look. A story with only a blurry shape and a second-hand account and an unsettling word is an open story, one with a gap in it, and a gap functions as an invitation, asking every listener to lean in and fill the space themselves. Every person who hears it, shudders, and adds their own imagined detail becomes, in a small way, a co-author. That's why it spreads, not despite the lack of evidence, but largely because of it. Now, the natural follow-up question is whether, underneath all the fan art and forum posts, there's at least one piece of genuine footage somewhere, one real clip a serious person captured with a serious camera. And this is actually the strangest part of the whole phenomenon once you sit down and look closely at what's actually being shared. Search the term today and the same handful of images keep circulating, passed around for the better part of 2 decades. Slow down and study any one of them individually, and the spell starts to loosen. There's the widely shared image people describe as a satellite still, a vast pale form supposedly caught from above near the ice, its outline suggesting a body, a head, the hint of limbs. It gets passed around as though pulled from some official archive nobody was meant to see. But look closer. There's no scale anywhere in the frame, nothing to tell you whether you're looking at something 30 meters long or 3. There's no timestamp that holds up to checking, no coordinates leading anywhere real, no traceable source. What's actually there is a pale shape on a dark field, and everything else, the size, the menace, the anatomy, is something the viewer brought with them. Then there are the blurry, pale, half-submerged forms, rounded at one end and tapering at the other, and the eye immediately does what eyes always do with an ambiguous shape. It finds a head, it finds shoulders, it constructs a person out of a smear. But a whale surfacing at an odd angle produces exactly that kind of smear. A slab of sea ice, sculpted smooth by weeks of wind, melt, and refreeze, produces exactly that smear. Sun-bleached foam churning on the back of a swell produces it too. None of these widely circulated images show something that could only be a mysterious creature. Every single one shows something that could plausibly be several ordinary things, and that ocean is genuinely full of ordinary things that look wrong in bad light. And then, especially over the last couple of years, there are the new images, the unsettlingly clean ones. A pale humanoid figure rising smoothly out of black polar water, skin rendered in crisp, almost photographic detail, a hand spreading 5 fingers, a face turning toward the camera. These aren't coming from research vessels at all. They're coming from AI image generators. They can be produced in seconds by anyone with a keyboard and a text prompt, and they keep getting more convincing every few months. The older Ningen was a rumor with no body attached to it. The newer Ningen has thousands of bodies now, and every single one of them is manufactured. So it's worth doing what a careful investigator actually does here, laying out the ordinary explanations honestly, one at a time. The first category is straightforward fabrication, the illustrations, digital paintings, and now AI-generated images, some made as genuine art, some as jokes, some specifically to keep the legend fed with fresh evidence. These are the easiest to set aside because they were never actually trying to function as proof. They're portraits of a monster, not photographs of one. The second category is misidentified animals, and this deserves real respect, because the Southern Ocean genuinely holds giants. A whale glimpsed from an odd angle, pale belly briefly turned toward the sky, can read as something enormous and vaguely limbed. Colossal squid, among the largest and least understood animals on the planet, drift through those depths. A carcass, bloated and bleached and softened by cold water, can lose every recognizable feature and become a shapeless pale mass that resembles nothing that should logically exist. A real animal simply misread at the edge of vision in failing light. The third category is the ice and water themselves. Sea ice doesn't hold neat geometric slabs. It melts and refreezes into smooth, organic, genuinely uncanny curves and hollows that the eye insists on reading as something alive. Waves and foam constantly shift, offering a suggestive shape for half a second before dissolving into the next wave entirely. In a place that's mostly white, gray, and in constant motion, the sea itself functions as a canvas that never stops sketching momentary suggestions of life. The fourth and final category is the one happening entirely inside the observer's own skull. Pareidolia, the same wiring that makes people see a face in an electrical outlet or a figure in a shifting shadow. Human brains are built to flag 100 false positives for person, rather than risk missing one real one, because for most of human history, missing a real threat was far more costly than a false alarm. Standing on a freezing rail at the end of a long, exhausting watch, primed by a word you already know and half expect to encounter, that pattern recognition machinery runs at full intensity. Nobody consciously decides to see a Ningen. The brain hands over a finished, human-like shape before conscious reasoning ever gets a vote. Put those 4 explanations together: fabricated imagery, misidentified marine animals, the strange organic geometry of polar ice and water, and ordinary pattern matching under difficult viewing conditions, and there's genuinely nothing left over that requires an undiscovered giant humanoid to explain. The honest, unglamorous verdict is this. The Ningen isn't a biological creature waiting patiently to be formally discovered in the Antarctic deep. It's a well-documented piece of modern internet folklore, born on an anonymous message board, dressed up in the borrowed credibility of untraceable experts, and carried around the world by the one thing every durable legend absolutely needs: a gap in the middle shaped exactly like a human being, one that each new viewer is invited to fill in themselves. None of that means there's nothing left to be curious about here, because the actual mystery hasn't disappeared, it's simply relocated. The genuine unknown was never really the creature. It's how much of that ocean remains completely unexplored. We really have mapped the surface of the moon in finer detail than long stretches of the southern ocean floor. There are trenches down there no human eye has ever examined, pressures that would fold a submarine like cardboard, cold black water that has never once been disturbed by any camera or expedition. The honest wonder isn't that a giant human-shaped creature might be hiding somewhere in all that darkness. It's simply how little we still actually know about what's really down there. And there's one more genuine mystery worth sitting with, which is why a story with no body, no bones, and no real evidence can still manage to raise the hair on the back of your neck at 2 in the morning. Why every couple of years the same pale shape resurfaces and pulls in a fresh wave of people who, on some level, already know better. We're entering an era where anyone can generate a photorealistic monster in a matter of seconds, and the Ningen turns out to be a nearly perfect test case for exactly that shift, a creature that was never really built out of evidence at all, but out of wanting. So it's worth asking honestly, which version of this footage actually got to you first, the one that made you lean in before your reasoning caught up? And underneath that, the real question this entire legend runs on: did some quiet part of you want it to be true anyway?